Silence. It's a word we often associate with peace and tranquility. But what if silence is merely the calm before the storm, a deceptive quiet that portends disaster? What if the deadliest trap isn't found in the din of battle, but in its sudden, blinding transformation? Today, we delve into a story that will make you wonder. How did what should have been a triumph turn into a crushing defeat in just a few hours? And how can one seemingly simple element, light, change the course of an entire battle? Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Imagine this: 3:30 a.m., June 17th, 1944. The Saipan Beachhead. In the pitch black, 37 Japanese tanks rumbled down a ravine leading to the Marine Corps radio station. Colonel Tadashi Goto, commander of this armored fist, was absolutely confident. His Type 95 tanks, relying on mass and surprise, would crush the American defensive line. According to tank doctrine, night attacks are often successful because defenders are deprived of the ability to see the approaching enemy. But suddenly overhead, like artificial suns, illumination rounds burst. Sergeant Chuck Shearer grips his bazooka tightly as the battlefield becomes as bright as day. Blinded by this sudden piercing light, the Japanese tankers instantly realize that their armor, only 12 to 25 meters thick, will provide no protection against the torrent of fire the Marines are about to unleash. The tanks, intended to seize the beachhead in a matter of minutes, were now clearly silhouetted against the sky, becoming easy targets. No cover, no surprise, not the slightest chance of success. 6 hours later, 31 burning hulks would litter the ground, but the Japanese never saw the approaching chain of destruction. The silence that enveloped the Saipan beachhead with the onset of dusk on June 16th proved to be deceptive. Sergeant Chuck Shearer, feeling the M1 bazooka's olive-drab finish still holding the warmth of the day's heat, adjusts his grip. Around him, 6 Marines had spent the latter half of the day diligently deepening their positions. These fortifications now seemed far more reliable than anything they had managed to create in the chaotic first hours after landing. Artillery crews had finally completed ranging their 105mm guns on the approaches. Bazooka teams, including Shearer's, received clear instructions on probable enemy avenues of advance. Range cards marked reference points for the western ravine, which led directly to the radio station behind their positions. Private First Class Robert Brown crouched nearby, checking his M6A3 rockets for the 3rd time since sunset. The blunt-nosed warheads looked almost crude compared to the elegant artillery shells they had watched arcing through the sky all day. However, Brown knew exactly what shaped charges were capable of, having seen them in action during training at Pendleton. The physics was simple enough. A copper cone focuses an explosion into a powerful jet capable of penetrating armor, regardless of the angle of impact. Against the 12-25mm plates on Japanese tanks, this would be lethal at 100 to 150 yards. Lieutenant Colonel John Walker, as darkness deepened, moved among the positions, his calm presence bolstering the confidence the men already felt in their bones. The beachhead was holding. Moreover, it was beginning to look like something that could indeed survive the night. M3 Silversum motor carriages were skillfully positioned in cover behind the forward companies. Their crews practiced fire missions with the precision and confidence of men who thoroughly knew their business. In reserve, ready to engage, waited a platoon of M4A2 Shermans. Their 75-millimeter guns were loaded with high-explosive rounds capable of finishing off anything that lighter weapons might damage. The radio station buzzed with activity, operators maintaining continuous communication with the distant fleet. The USS California and her escort were assigned counter-battery missions, but their illumination rounds were available on demand. 5-inch illumination rounds could instantly turn night into day across a several hundred-yard front, and artillery officers had already meticulously mapped fire concentration zones along the most probable enemy approach routes. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Shira, a Guadalcanal veteran, knew the sound of Japanese preparations well. The distant rumble of engines had been building since midnight, punctuated by the grinding of tracks on coral and sharp commands that carried much farther in the tropical air than men could imagine. But this noise felt different. It was larger in scale. Such a roar meant someone was committing all their forces to one decisive breakthrough. At 03:30, the night exploded. Bugles blared over the ravine as the first tanks appeared in groups of 4 or 5, their silhouettes barely discernible against the darker mass of the ridge behind them. Infantry, riding on the tanks and following in skirmish lines, already chattered with their light machine guns at suspected marine positions. Type 95s, Shira realized. The very ones they had been briefed on, but never in such numbers. 37 of them, by his quick count, moved with the confidence of crews who genuinely believed that surprise was still on their side. Walker's voice crackled over the radio net, yet was calm and clear. Illumination fire for effect. Seconds later, flares burst overhead like artificial suns, their harsh white light turning the battlefield into a photographer's nightmare of stark shadows and bleached coral. The Japanese tanks, suddenly exposed, seemed to hesitate as their crews realized that darkness was no longer their ally. Brown loaded his first rocket, fully ready. The M1 Bazooka weighed only 13 pounds empty, light enough for 2 men to maneuver quickly between positions. However, its shape-charged warhead made it lethal against any armor the Japanese could field. At 120 yards, well within effective range, he aligned the simple iron sights on the lead tank's flank and squeezed the trigger. The rocket streaked through the opening with its characteristic whistle, striking the Type 95 just ahead of the track. The shaped charge detonated with a sharp crack that was almost anticlimactic compared to the fireworks overhead. But the tank stopped, smoke pouring from its fighting compartment. The infantry on the tank, scattered as a second bazooka team, engaged another target. The 37-meter guns opened fire with their characteristic bark, switching between armor-piercing and canister rounds as targets appeared. At 500 yards, their armor-piercing rounds could penetrate 53 meters of armor at a 30-degree angle, more than enough to pierce the thin plates protecting Japanese tank crews. When infantry bunched up in the open, canister rounds turned the guns into giant shotguns. Each round contained hundreds of steel balls that swept through engagement zones with mechanical efficiency. Colonel Tadashi Goto had planned this offensive in strict adherence to a doctrine emphasizing mass and momentum. His Type 95s were equipped with 37-meter guns, effective against infantry but significantly outranged by every weapon the Marines employed. Worse, the 12-25-meter armor protecting his crews was designed for a completely different type of warfare, one where anti-tank weapons were heavy, rare, and difficult to position effectively. Under the illumination rounds, these assumptions crumbled, exposing the fatal vulnerability of the Japanese offensive. Pacific Ocean, 1944. Deep night, on a tiny unknown atoll, lost somewhere amidst the boundless waters, an event unfolds that will forever change the course of history. Ordinary people, like Shira and Brown, face unimaginable horror as their assumptions collapse in an instant. How did they survive? What allowed them to turn the tide of battle in a seemingly hopeless situation? And what if I told you that each of us, in our lives, faces similar assumptions that crumble, forcing us to seek new paths? Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. On that fateful night, as the Japanese Type 95 tanks advanced, it seemed the island's fate was sealed. However, the Marine Corps, with its unprecedented effectiveness, was already prepared. Bazooka teams like ghosts moved between positions, delivering precise, inescapable shots and instantly relocating before the enemy could react. The 2.36-inch rockets, not relying on kinetic energy, penetrated armor thanks to a shaped charge that, through a chemical reaction, transformed copper into a superheated jet. This jet burned through steel plate like a cutting torch, leaving behind only molten edges. As more enemy tanks stopped or caught fire, MB-3 7-timers motor carriages entered the fray. Their powerful 7-timers, possessing devastating high explosive power, had eagerly awaited their targets since the landing. Shells rained down with thunderous impacts, shaking the ground and scattering debris in every direction. Nearby, a platoon of Shermans moved into positions ideally suited for flanking attacks on the Japanese columns. Under the bright illumination provided by the fleet from offshore, it felt more like a firing exercise than a bloody battle. The M4A2 tanks, equipped with the same 75mm guns as the self-propelled carriages, but boasting improved armor protection and maneuverability, could rapidly change positions, adapting to the evolving fight. Brown, with practiced precision, loaded another rocket, while Shira selected the next target. One of the Type 95s approached to within 100 yards of their position. At that range, the Marines could clearly see the panic in the tank commander's movements as he desperately tried to aim his gun at their positions. The rocket struck the tank's side, easily penetrating the thin armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The tank lurched to a halt, its main gun pointed uselessly at the sky. By dawn, the western ravine would be littered with 31 burning hulks. Their crews would be dead or scattered. Japan's 9th Tank Regiment would cease to exist as a viable fighting force, its commander among the casualties. But in those first minutes after AO330, as illumination rounds turned night into day and shaped charges began their deadly work, the outcome was still being decided by men like Shira and Brown, Marines who had learned to translate American industrial might into precise, devastating firepower capable of stopping any banzai charge. Lieutenant Colonel Walker, observing the battle's development from his command post, realized that victory would be achieved not by a single weapon, but by the meticulous coordination of overlapping fires. The Western Ravine, leading from Gapon to the radio station, had seemed an obvious approach route during daytime planning sessions. perhaps too obvious, but the Japanese chose it nonetheless. Now, that choice worked in the Marines' favor, funneling enemy armor into pre-prepared kill zones that were laid out with methodological precision, honed by Walker over 2 decades of peacetime training. The chain of destruction functioned exactly as intended. Sergeant Shira's bazooka team disabled the lead elements in the first minutes of contact, knocking out tracks and shocking crews at ranges where shaped charges were guaranteed to penetrate armor. The Type 95 tanks, with their 12 or 25 mm armor, offered no meaningful protection against weapons that generated their lethality through chemical energy rather than kinetic impact. Each M6A3 rocket carried a copper cone that focused the explosive force into a jet capable of burning through steel plate, regardless of angle or ricochet. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And, of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. As the Japanese advance stalled under the initial bazooka fire, the 37 mm guns shifted their attention to the infantry riding on the tanks and following in skirmish lines. Corporal Martinez had trained his crew to switch between armor-piercing and canister rounds with practiced efficiency, assessing the tactical situation and selecting ammunition appropriate for the target. At 400 yards, his gun could penetrate the frontal armor of any Japanese tank on the battlefield. When infantry bunched up in the open, canister rounds turned the weapon into a giant shotgun that swept through engagement zones with hundreds of steel balls. The M3 17.5 mm gun motor carriages represented the next layer of the defensive system, positioned in cover behind the forward companies. Their crews possessed decisive, high-explosive power at close range and the mobility to regroup as the battle developed. Staff Sergeant Williams had positioned his self-propelled gun to cover the northern approach to the radio station. Its 75 mm gun was loaded with rounds that could finish off any tank damaged by lighter weapons without completely destroying it. Behind the self-propelled guns, a platoon of Shermans waited with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was being driven towards them. The M4A2 tanks carried the same 75 mm gun as the self-propelled carriages, but had better armor protection and tactical flexibility afforded by full-track mobility. Their crews had been briefed on the Japanese armor they were likely to encounter. Lightly armored vehicles, armed with 37 mm and 47 mm guns, effective against infantry but outranged by American weapons in these terrain and lighting conditions. The illumination rounds overhead provided the crucial element, tying all these weapons together. Without illumination, Japanese tanks could have closed to ranges where their less powerful guns might still inflict casualties. Under the harsh white light of the 5-inch naval rounds, surprise was impossible, and camouflage became a liability rather than an advantage. Tank commanders, who had planned to use darkness for a massed assault, now found themselves silhouetted against the coral like targets on a firing range. Private Nakamura, hunched over his Type 95's 37mm gun, struggled to acquire targets that appeared and disappeared with maddening unpredictability. The Marine positions were prepared with overlapping fields of fire, denying his crew clear shots while simultaneously exposing his tank to weapons capable of penetrating its armor from ranges where return fire was ineffective. Many military commanders, and even outside observers, sometimes fall prey to outdated doctrines, believing that brute force or conventional methods will always lead to victory. But history and our story today has repeatedly proven otherwise. Imagine 37 steel giants moving with relentless power, ready to crush everything in their path. Would you believe that a single erroneous assumption sealed their doom? That their might would turn into helplessness against a meticulously planned defense? How is this possible? And what exactly caused this seemingly unstoppable attack to turn into a slaughter? Today, we will delve into events where a clash of doctrines determined the outcome of a battle, demonstrating how technological superiority and tactical flexibility can completely nullify a numerical advantage. We will discover why an outdated doctrine, based on mass and momentum, proved powerless. We will find out exactly what marine tactics turned this ravine into a deadly trap. And most importantly, we will understand how foresight and training can reverse the course of any confrontation. Stay with us until the end, and you will see how just a few tactical decisions can render an entire armada worthless, turning it into a pile of useless metal. This is not only a story of war, but also of fundamental principles of adaptation and innovation that remain relevant to this day. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Initially, the fire aimed at stopping this wave was completely ineffective. The doctrine that led 37 tanks down this ravine rested on the erroneous belief that sheer mass and unstoppable momentum could overcome any, even the most prepared, defense. However, these fundamental assumptions were formulated for a completely different type of battle, not accounting for the new reality of the battlefield. In contrast to the enemy's outdated notions, the sequence of actions, meticulously developed by Walker earlier in the day, unfolded with striking precision, reminiscent of a training exercise. Bazookas, formidable weapons in the hands of the Marines, instantly deprived the armored vehicles of mobility and shocked the crews at ranges of 100 to 150 yards. This distance was chosen deliberately. It allowed the shaped charges to operate with maximum destructive effectiveness, penetrating armor. Simultaneously, 37mm guns fired at ranges up to 500 yards, skillfully switching between armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating 53mm of armor at a 30-degree angle, and canister rounds which turned dense infantry concentrations into a ruthless casualty count. Completing this deadly symphony were the 75mm guns, both self-propelled and tank-mounted, finishing off anything that still retained the ability to move or posed any threat to the Marine defensive positions. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Colonel Goto, commanding the Japanese forces, committed his regiment to battle based on tactics that had once proven effective in campaigns in China and the early stages of the Pacific War. In those days, American forces indeed suffered from a lack of adequate anti-tank weaponry, and no less importantly, proper training in its application. Saipan, however, presented a completely different reality. Here, the Marines operating these deadly weapons had undergone intensive bazooka training since late 1943. They had thoroughly studied and learned to exploit all the advantages that chemical energy weapons offered against seemingly robust, but in reality vulnerable, thin armor. They perfectly understood that the M1 launcher's unique lack of recoil provided them with incredible mobility, allowing them to instantly move between firing positions. And most importantly, they realized that the shape charge warhead completely nullified armor thickness, rendering it irrelevant at effective firing ranges. This deep understanding of tactics and technology became the key factor determining the outcome of the engagement. Private Brown, with movements honed to near automaticity by countless training repetitions, was reloading another rocket. The blunt-nosed M6A3 warhead might have appeared somewhat crude compared to the aerodynamically refined projectiles fired by conventional artillery, but its devastating effectiveness against Japanese tanks had already been proven repeatedly on the battlefield. At 120 yards, a bazooka rocket struck with sufficient velocity to ensure flawless detonation of its shaped charge. The resulting jet of molten copper sliced through the Type 95 Japanese tank's side armor with incredible ease, leaving fatal consequences in its wake. The undeniable advantage in rate of fire lay entirely with the Marines' bazooka crews demonstrated astonishing speed, reloading and engaging new targets significantly faster than enemy tank crews could aim their weapons and find optimal firing solutions. 37mm guns, manned by experienced crews working at a rhythm honed by months of grueling training, could fire up to 25 rounds per minute. Even heavier artillery systems maintained a rate of fire that allowed them to engage multiple targets before Japanese forces could organize any effective return fire, thereby suppressing the enemy's initiative and keeping them under constant pressure. As the fierce battle entered its second, even more intense phase, Commander Walker realized with satisfaction that the entire meticulously planned defensive system was functioning exactly as designed. The overlapping fields of fire, which completely covered the entire western ravine, left no gaps where Japanese tanks could find any cover or reliable concealment. And the powerful illumination provided by naval artillery completely eliminated the cover of darkness that could potentially allow the enemy to infiltrate or conduct flanking maneuvers. But most importantly, it was the well-conceived combination of various weapon types that gave his Marines a unique ability to engage targets at ranges where their advantages in firepower and protection became absolutely decisive, predetermining the outcome of each engagement. The Type 95 tanks, which might have seemed so formidable and indestructible in the pre-dawn darkness, were revealed in the light as nothing more than obsolete machines, operated by undeniably brave, but alas, doomed men sent on a patently impossible mission. Their 12-25mm armor, while perhaps adequate protection against small arms fire and shell fragments, proved utterly useless against shaped charge weapons. This new, revolutionary weaponry bypassed traditional defenses not through kinetic energy impact, but through devastating chemical effects, burning through steel like paper. The Japanese tanks' own 37mm guns could, of course, penetrate Marine body armor and even reinforced sandbag positions, but they catastrophically lacked the power to effectively engage American tanks or self-propelled guns at decisive combat ranges, placing the Japanese crews at a severe disadvantage. Sergeant Shira selected the next target, watching as the Japanese offensive, despite everything, continued to funnel more and more tanks directly into the predetermined kill zone. The tactical task for his team had now become almost elementary, boiling down to a clear sequence of actions. Detect, aim, fire, immediately change position, and reload. The shape charge did the rest, the most destructive work, transforming the complex physics of its explosion into unstoppable armor penetration that no amount of steel plate could prevent. Around him, the entire Dakota 41 continued its methodical and relentless work, each weapon system contributing to an outcome that became inevitable the moment naval illumination rounds turned pitch black night into bright day. At 03:45, the 5-inch gun of the USS California once again broke the night silence, firing another series of illumination rounds skyward over the western ravine, where Colonel Gotto's tanks continued their desperate yet doomed advance. These shells detonated with mechanical, almost surgical precision, each one bathing several hundred yards of coral formations and dense scrub in harsh, blinding white light. What had initially appeared to be a coordinated and powerful offensive was now rapidly disintegrating into a chaotic series of individual tank actions. Crews found themselves separated by the burning hulks of disabled vehicles and the increasingly accurate, relentless fire of the Marines, losing all possibility of organized resistance. Sergeant Shira, his gaze fixed on his bazooka's sight, tracked another Type 95 tank desperately attempting to maneuver around a burning hulk, the third destroyed by his team that night. The Japanese tank commander likely hoped to use the wreckage as temporary cover, but the constant bright illumination provided by the flares completely eliminated any dead space where Japanese armor could possibly hide. At 110 yards, well within the M6A3 rocket's effective range, Shira pulled the trigger without hesitation. He watched as the shaped charge detonated flawlessly in the tank's rear. The explosion was sharp and brief, but within seconds, thick black smoke billowed from the disabled tank's engine compartment, signaling its definitive incapacitation. Despite the deafening chaos around their position, Private Brown was already automatically loading the next round. The blunt-nosed warhead slid into the launcher with practiced ease, and Brown, tapping Shira on the shoulder, signaled readiness. Since the battle began, their team had fired 8 rockets, achieving 6 clear hits and 2 near misses that nonetheless forced Japanese crews to abandon their vehicles in panic. Shape charge technology, which might have seemed an almost theoretical concept during grueling training, proved devastatingly effective against armor incapable of providing any significant protection from penetrating elements utilizing chemical energy. This confirmed that the future of warfare had arrived, and old defensive methods were a thing of the past. Imagine deep night, the tropical heat of Saipan. You're in a tank, ready for a decisive thrust meant to crush enemy defenses. Darkness is your loyal ally, concealing every movement, offering an illusion of invulnerability. But what if that darkness suddenly transforms into a bright, merciless spotlight, exposing you for all to see, like a target at a shooting range? Have you ever felt a meticulously crafted plan collapse in an instant, and an unseen enemy, seemingly weaker, suddenly unleash devastating power? This is precisely what happened to the Japanese tankers on Saipan, whose night attack turned into a catastrophe. How did the night's darkness, usually an attacker's ally, become a deadly trap for them? Could outdated tactics lead to complete annihilation, even with numerical superiority? And how did a few accurate shots and a couple of illumination flares turn the tide of an entire battle, predetermining its outcome? In this video, we'll uncover the secrets of how American Marines inflicted a crushing defeat on a Japanese tank regiment using tactics that forever changed the understanding of night combat. And the first, most shocking technique that completely broke the patterns of Japanese command was incredibly simple. In that fateful hour when Colonel Goto committed his 37 tanks to battle, counting on the element of surprise under the cover of darkness, the sky above the battlefield erupted in flashes. These were illumination rounds fired by American forces, instantly transforming the night battlefield into a deadly arena where Japanese armor stood out in clear silhouettes against the sky, stripped of all camouflage and any chance of surprise. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription, and of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And so, when the Japanese tanks, stripped of the night's cover, became visible as if in the palm of one's hand, those who had honed their skills through months of training went to work. Corporal Martinez, positioned on the left, methodically fired his 37mm gun. His crew, with professional composure, switched to armor-piercing rounds as more and more Japanese tanks entered their carefully calculated kill zone. Each shot was not just an attempt, but a precise calculation, aimed at ranges where penetration was guaranteed. Martinez's gun, capable of penetrating over 50mm of armor at a 38-degree angle at 450 yards, easily dealt with the Type 95's protection, which was more than twice as thin. The tank he had just been tracking suddenly halted when his shell pierced the turret ring, instantly disabling the main gun and likely ending the gunner's life. But this was just the beginning. For riding on the tank hulls, under the cover of armor, was Japanese infantry, who now found themselves then dismounted directly into the zone of deadly canister fire. With incredible speed honed by months of rigorous training, Martinez changed ammunition types. Soon, his gun transformed into a giant shotgun loaded with canister rounds. Each such round containing hundreds of steel balls, scattered in a deadly pattern, perfectly suited for clearing trenches and suppressing infantry positions. For enemy soldiers caught in the open under the merciless light of the flares, the effect was truly devastating, leaving them no chance of survival. But what happened when even 37mm guns proved insufficient? Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The moment Japanese tanks dangerously approached the Marine perimeter, Staff Sergeant Williams brought his formidable M3 75mm self-propelled gun into action. Its high explosive rounds were designed to finish what lighter calibers had started. Any tank that had miraculously survived bazooka hits or penetrations from 37mm guns now faced a weapon capable of reducing it to powder. Williams' first target was a Type 95, already missing a track from bazooka fire, but still desperately attempting to engage Marine positions with its 37mm gun. A powerful 75mm shell struck it directly below the turret, and the tank instantly vanished in a blinding ball of orange flame. But even this wasn't enough to stop the entire tank column. What other surprises did the Americans have in store for the enemy's flanks? Meanwhile, a platoon of mighty Shermans moved into new positions from which they could effectively attack the flanks of the Japanese columns with their 75mm guns. Lieutenant Hayes expertly positioned his M4A2, providing cover for the southern approach to the vital radio station. His crew, loaded high-explosive shells, whose range surpassed anything the Japanese tanks could counter. In this deadly tank duel, the advantage undeniably belonged to the side with superior optics, long-range guns, and of course perfect illumination, allowing all these superiorities to be effectively utilized. But how did this firepower feel from the other side of the barricades inside a Japanese tank? Inside one of the Japanese Type 95s, Private Nakamura desperately tried to traverse the turret, aiming his gun at the muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared with terrifying unpredictability. His 37mm gun, once effective against Chinese forces and early American units, was now utterly useless against the Marines, who had learned to coordinate their fire with surgical precision. The tank's 12mm frontal armor, capable of stopping rifle bullets and shrapnel, could provide no protection against bazooka rockets, which had already disabled most of his squadron. Suddenly, a shaped charge struck the left side of his vehicle, penetrating the armor with a sharp, deafening crack, a sound that had become the signature of this battle. Nakamura felt a powerful shockwave rip through the fighting compartment, followed by acrid smoke from burning metal and rubber. The driver slumped lifelessly over the controls, and hydraulic fluid sprayed like a fountain from severed hoses. Within seconds, the fighting compartment filled with such dense smoke that breathing became impossible and vision useless. This was the price of outdated doctrine. But what was Colonel Goto thinking, throwing his men into this meat grinder? Colonel Goto, commanding the Japanese forces, committed 37 tanks to this attack, genuinely believing that a massive strike and surprise would crush the Marine defenses. However, surprise was not to be. It was ruthlessly eliminated by illumination rounds that transformed the night battlefield into a deadly arena, where Japanese armor stood out in clear silhouettes against the sky. The doctrine, successfully applied in previous campaigns, was based on the assumption that American forces lacked adequate anti-tank capabilities and the proper training to use them effectively. But on Saipan, these outdated assumptions proved fatal, costing the Japanese army an entire tank regiment. What then was the final horrific outcome of this night's slaughter? By 04:30 a.m., as the last echoes of the night battle still lingered in the air, a grim scene unfolded. 24 Japanese tanks were destroyed in the 6th Marine sector alone. Their mangled hulks littered the coral plateau, like silent monuments to tactical obsolescence. Bazooka crews, demonstrating incredible effectiveness, accounted for approximately half of all tanks. Their shaped charge warheads clearly proved that chemical energy could penetrate any armor, regardless of its thickness, at these combat ranges. 37mm guns added 6 more tanks to this tally, using armor-piercing rounds that easily pierced armor at ranges where Japanese return fire was completely ineffective. The remaining tanks were finished off by heavier weaponry, 75mm self-propelled guns and Shermans, whose high explosive shells left nothing salvageable. Japanese infantry, stripped of armored support, continued their desperate attacks, almost until 07 DAS. But without the steel fists of tanks, their assault lacked sufficient force to seriously threaten Marine positions. When the first rays of dawn finally appeared over the western ravine, a scene of complete, total destruction unfolded. 31 Japanese tanks lay motionless on the scarred coral, some still burning, others already beginning to succumb to corrosion in the humid tropical climate. The 9th Tank Regiment ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. Its commander was dead, and the few surviving crews were scattered and demoralized. The Beachhead, which Japanese command intended to capture in mere hours, held firm, having sustained losses that were almost negligible compared to the slaughter inflicted upon the attackers. But what did those who delivered this crushing blow feel? Private Shira, one of those who held the key to this victory, lowered his bazooka and Annie, with the deep satisfaction of a master who had flawlessly executed his work, surveyed the battlefield. Around him, other Marines were already beginning to count the twisted hulks and gather valuable intelligence from the wrecked vehicles, shaped charge warheads, which during training seemed almost too simple in concept, proved incredibly effective in a tank battle that would undoubtedly be studied in military academies for decades. On Saipan, American industrial might and tactical innovation clashed with Japanese courage and, unfortunately, tactical rigidity. The outcome of this confrontation was never in doubt from the moment the first illumination rounds began to fall from the sky. Dawn finally revealed the full scale of the catastrophe that befell Colonel Goto's 9th Tank Regiment, becoming a stark lesson in how adaptability and technology can turn the tide of any, even the most desperate battle. Imagine the night, darkness, pierced only by flashes of gunfire, and from this darkness, steel monsters, tanks seemingly invulnerable, bear down on you. A feeling of hopelessness when familiar weapons are useless. Is this the end? Or is there a way to stop them when all other methods are exhausted? We will tell you a story that revolutionized tank battles, showing how a single innovation turned formidable machines into piles of scrap metal. How fragile hope transformed into a crushing victory when all seemed lost. You will learn why tactics that had worked for decades suddenly became suicidal, and what simple, at first glance, weapon became the key to this turning point. Are you ready to discover the secret that changed the course of the war? Prepare yourselves, because what you are about to hear will make you rethink everything you knew about strength and vulnerability. On the coral plains leading to the vital radio station, 31 charred, twisted tank hulks heralded the complete collapse of Japanese armored power on Saipan. Sergeant Shira, with the methodical precision of a professional soldier, carefully moved among the wreckage. His gaze, like an X-ray, noted the smallest details of battle damage, observing how various weapon types had affected the Type 95 tanks, which now lay on the ground like children's toys carelessly discarded after play. The very process of counting these defeated machines clearly demonstrated the immense complexity and chaotic nature of large-scale military engagements. Lieutenant Colonel Walker, in his detailed combat report, documented no fewer than 24 tanks destroyed within the immediate sector of the 6th Marine Regiment. However, the accounts of the Marines themselves and subsequent post-war counts conducted across the entire Beachhead confidently indicated 31 completely destroyed tanks. This notable discrepancy was not an error. It reflected the inherent chaos of night battles where sector boundaries became meaningless once the fighting began. Daylight recounts revealed additional hulks, and inevitable duplication led to different units claiming credit for the same kills. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. While these assessments were underway, reconnaissance teams were already meticulously examining the wreckage. They not only photographed the unique nature of the damage, but also collected samples of Japanese armor steel for subsequent metallurgical analysis. The study revealed that although the thin steel constituting the protection of these tanks represented the pinnacle of Japanese industrial thought in 1944, it proved fatally inadequate against a new generation of weaponry, whose lethality was based not on brute kinetic force, but on destructive chemical energy. 12 to 25 millimeters of armor plating, capable of stopping conventional projectiles, offered no significant resistance to shape-charge warheads, which pierced the steel with jets of molten copper like a hot knife through butter. Private Brown, whose team had knocked out the last Type 95 tank during the night, carefully inspected his target. He noted how the M6A3 rocket had neatly penetrated the rear armor before detonating inside the fighting compartment. The entry hole was surprisingly small, perhaps only 3 inches in diameter, but the internal destruction was truly catastrophic. The principle of shaped charges was elegant in its simplicity. They focused the energy of an explosion into a narrow jet that traveled at speeds measured in miles per second, creating temperatures high enough to melt steel on contact. This physical characteristic, which converted basic chemistry into armor penetration, rendered the thickness of the armor completely irrelevant. The bazooka proved its unprecedented effectiveness on Saipan, astonishing even its most ardent supporters. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Okay, so the introduction is mostly clear, but what about the rest of the video? Here, we introduce something called an Markquote where each segment of your video contains a hint about the next. The viewer shouldn't realize where a new segment begins. It's always a cohesive story where one introduction seamlessly transitions into the next hook. All video parts exist only on paper and for you, but for the viewer, there's just an engaging video. The 236-inch M1 launcher, weighing only 13 pounds when empty, was light enough for 2-man teams to rapidly change positions between shots. More importantly, the weapon produced no recoil that could give away firing positions to enemy observers, giving the gunners an invaluable advantage. Sergeant Shira's team fired 11 rockets during that fierce night engagement, achieving 9 direct hits and forcing 2 Japanese crews to abandon their vehicles in panic. The shape-charge warheads performed exactly as designed, penetrating armor at ranges up to 150 yards, completely independent of the impact angle or the initial armor thickness. Staff Sergeant Williams, walking along the line of destroyed tanks, grew increasingly respectful of this weapon system, which had seemed almost too revolutionary during training. The M1 bazooka represented a fundamental shift in anti-tank warfare, replacing heavy guns that required multiple crew members and complex positioning with a lightweight weapon usable by a trained rifleman. The principle of chemical energy meant that even a private with 6 weeks of training could destroy tanks that previously required powerful artillery pieces or specialized anti-tank guns to defeat. Humidity issues that plagued early bazooka operations in the Pacific had been largely resolved by improvements in the M9 rocket design. The blunt-nosed warheads used on Saipan featured copper cones precisely manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, ensuring consistent performance even in harsh tropical conditions that could disable less sophisticated weapons. What began as an experimental system was rapidly becoming standard equipment for Marine infantry units expecting to encounter enemy armor. Colonel Goto's body was found near his Type 97 command tank, which had been struck by several bazooka rockets before a 75mm round from a Sherman tank delivered the final blow. His death symbolized more than just the loss of a regimental commander. It marked the end of an entire Japanese tank doctrine, designed for a completely different war and a different theater of operations. Mass tank attacks, which had been effective in China and in early Pacific campaigns, were rendered obsolete against defenders equipped with adequate anti-tank measures and trained to use them effectively. The tactical lessons learned from the wreckage were profound and undeniable. Japanese armor was designed for infantry support missions, where thin armor was considered adequate protection against small arms fire and shell fragments. The 37mm and 40mm guns mounted on most Japanese tanks were effective against lightly armored targets, but they fatally lacked the power to engage American armor at meaningful distances. Most critically, Japanese tank doctrine assumed that night attacks would provide advantages of surprise and concealment that could overcome superior enemy firepower. However, under the illumination of star shells, these assumptions completely collapsed, exposing their utter unviability. 5-inch naval shells, which turned night into day, eliminated any possibility of surprise or concealment, while the superior optics and fire control systems on American weapons allowed for accurate targeting at ranges where Japanese guns were utterly ineffective. The casualty ratio achieved in the night engagement, 31 Japanese tanks destroyed against negligible Marine armor losses, reflected technological and tactical advantages that far exceeded mere numerical superiority. Scouts examining the destroyed vehicles found undeniable evidence of hasty modifications, suggesting a Japanese awareness of their armor's inadequacy. Some tanks had additional steel plates welded to vital areas, while others showed signs of improvised side skirts, designed to protect against shape-charge warheads. These field modifications proved utterly useless against weapons that generated armor penetration through chemical energy rather than kinetic impact. But they clearly revealed the Japanese understanding that their equipment was hopelessly obsolete. Have you ever felt like you're fighting ghosts of the past, using methods that have long lost their relevance? That your efforts, however heroic, are crashing against a wall of unseen progress? We've all been there, on a battlefield where yesterday's rules no longer apply. But what if there's a way not just to survive, but to completely flip the script? Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic chapters of World War II in the Pacific, when in just a few hours, an entire armored division was wiped off the map. How was this possible? What weapon changed the tide of battle and rendered yesterday's heroes helpless? And why, despite their bravery, did an entire tactical doctrine prove fatally obsolete? Get ready to learn about 3 key factors that transformed ordinary infantry into an unstoppable force against seemingly invincible tanks. And believe me, the first one will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about warfare. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Their military equipment, once formidable, was hopelessly outdated. The M6A3 rocket, which demonstrated incredible effectiveness, carried a shape-charge warhead containing only about 2 pounds of explosive, meticulously arranged around a precisely machined copper cone. Upon target impact, the explosive detonated from the rear to the front, instantly collapsing the cone into a jet of molten metal. This jet, moving at speeds approaching 2 miles per second, maintained its integrity for several inches, effortlessly penetrating even the thinnest armor of Japanese tanks and continuing its lethal path into the fighting compartments, where it produced a devastating effect. Sergeant Shira, surveying the battlefield, collected empty rocket tubes scattered around his position. Each one was a silent testament to a destroyed Japanese tank that would never again pose a threat to Marine positions. An expenditure of 11 rockets for 9 confirmed kills represented efficiency metrics that would have seemed utterly impossible with conventional anti-tank weapons. The principle of the shaped charge essentially transformed infantry units into highly effective tank hunters, completely eliminating the need for specialized anti-tank guns, which were extremely difficult to position and vulnerable to enemy counterfire. As the burial teams began their grim work of extracting Japanese casualties from the wrecked tanks, the full extent of the 9th Tank Regiment's destruction became crystal clear. An entire armored unit had been completely annihilated in less than 4 hours of fierce combat. Its personnel losses approached 100%, and equipment losses were absolute. The regiment, slated to lead the recapture of Saipan, would never fight again. Its surviving soldiers were scattered, and its tactical doctrine proved fatally outdated and incapable of confronting the new reality. The bazooka crews who achieved this incredible destruction were already cleaning their weapons and preparing for their next mission. Their confidence in American technology and superior training was not merely reinforced but solidified by a night of successful combat. They had proven that shaped charge weapons could penetrate any armor the Japanese could field, transforming the Pacific War into a contest between American industrial might and Japanese courage, a contest that could only have one predictable outcome. 2 nights later, fatigue hung over the Marine positions, as thick as the tropical humidity. But the tank threat, which had dominated tactical planning since D-Day, had vanished forever. Sergeant Shira sat in his foxhole, meticulously cleaning his M1 bazooka, which had become an integral part of his professional identity. Every detail received methodical attention, allowing the weapon to remain operational in an environment designed to destroy machinery. Around him, 6 Marines maintained their vigilance with the calm confidence of men who had proven their mettle against the enemy's best efforts and emerged victorious. The Japanese made another attempt on the night of June 18th, but without armored support, their attacks lacked sufficient force to seriously threaten the Beachhead perimeter. Infantry assaults that might have succeeded against unprepared positions shattered against the resilience of the Marines who had integrated their weapons into overlapping fields of fire, leaving no single loophole for penetration. The 37mm guns, which previously destroyed tanks, now switched to canister rounds, sweeping approach routes with steel balls, while bazooka teams regrouped to cover dead zones inaccessible to conventional weapons. Lieutenant Colonel Walker reviewed intelligence reports that painted a picture of Japanese desperation across Saipan. With the complete annihilation of the 9th Tank Regiment, enemy commanders had lost their primary tool for mobile counterattacks against the steadily expanding Beachhead. Type 95 tanks, representing the cutting edge of Japanese armored technology, proved to be obsolete machines operated by brave men on impossible missions. Their armor plates, ranging from 12 to 25 millimeter thick, could not provide protection against shaped charge weapons, which bypassed traditional defenses through chemical rather than kinetic energy. The chain of engagement that had functioned so effectively during the night battle was already being meticulously studied and refined for future operations. The illumination provided by naval gunfire completely eliminated the darkness Japanese forces needed for tactical surprise, while bazooka teams, operating at ranges of 100 to 150 yards, could engage targets with near-guaranteed penetration. The 37mm guns provided accurate fire at longer ranges. Their armor-piercing rounds were capable of penetrating over 50 millimeters of protection at a 30-degree angle to the normal. The 75mm guns, both self-propelled and tank-mounted, provided finishing power capable of destroying any target that survived the impact of lighter weapons. Private Brown became something of a celebrity among the other Marines. His role as a bazooka loader in 9 confirmed tank kills earned him recognition, which he accepted with the quiet pride of a professional who had performed his job brilliantly. The M6A3 rockets he operated during the engagement represented a technology that was transforming infantry warfare in ways that staff planners were only beginning to fully comprehend. Each warhead contained precisely engineered components that converted conventional explosives into armor-piercing systems capable of overcoming any defense the Japanese could field. The principle of the shaped charge was elegant in its simplicity. A powerful explosive positioned around a copper cone detonated from rear to front, collapsing the metal into a jet that traveled at speeds measured in miles per second. This jet maintained its coherence for several inches, easily penetrating steel plate regardless of thickness or angle, and continuing its destructive movement into the fighting compartments with lethal effect. The physics did not require complex calculations. Proper warhead detonation guaranteed armor penetration at effective ranges. Staff Sergeant Williams inspected the M3 75mm self-propelled gun, which formed the backbone of the defensive fire plan, noting how American industrial might had translated theoretical requirements into practical weapon systems. The tracked vehicle carried enough armor to protect its crew from small arms fire and shell fragments while mounting a gun capable of engaging any target on the Pacific battlefield. More importantly, its mobility allowed for rapid changes in firing positions, making it difficult for enemy observers to predict where defensive fire would originate. Imagine deep night, a hellish roar, and an unstoppable steel avalanche bearing down on you, seemingly doomed. Have you ever felt that chilling terror when enemy forces seem endless and your own fate is sealed? We know that feeling when it seemed there was no way out, but it's in such moments that legends are born. On that fateful night, on a distant Pacific island, the unthinkable happened. A defense that should have been crushed turned into a complete rout of the attackers. How? What allowed a handful of infantrymen not just to hold their ground, but to annihilate an entire tank regiment, changing the course of the entire campaign? And why did tactics once considered invincible lead to disaster for those who employed them? Get ready to discover how 3 key factors transformed a desperate defense into a triumphant victory. And here's the first one, which will shock you with its simplicity. Stay with us and watch until the end, because the most interesting part is just beginning. We'd be especially grateful for your like and subscription. And please, let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. In that decisive moment, as thunder and chaos reverberated across the battlefield, the platoon of Sherman tanks covering the positions embodied the essence of the American approach to armored vehicle design. This philosophy prioritized not brute firepower as much as mechanical reliability and maximum crew protection. The M4A2 variants, equipped with 70mm guns, possessed an undeniable range superiority over any Japanese tank armament. Their armor confidently withstood the 37mm and 47mm shells that armed most enemy combat vehicles. It was under the artificial daylight created by powerful searchlights and naval illumination rounds that these advantages became absolutely decisive, transforming American tanks into impregnable strongholds holding back the enemy's assault. Colonel Goto's demise was not merely the loss of a key officer for the Japanese command. It signified the collapse of an entire tactical doctrine that he personified. His approach, successfully proven in battles in China and during the early stages of the Pacific Campaign, was based on the assumption that mass tank attacks, relying on surprise and powerful momentum, could overwhelm even superior enemy firepower. In those days, American forces indeed suffered from a lack of adequate anti-tank measures and insufficient training for their effective use. However, on Saipan, these once successful assumptions turned into a fatal error. The enemy, now armed with bazookas and provided with bright illumination for accurate fire, was ready to meet this outdated tactic. Please stay with us and watch until the end, as the most important details are still ahead. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. As dawn broke through the smoke and haze, reconnaissance teams had already begun studying the destroyed Japanese tanks. Their reports, containing invaluable findings, were set to fundamentally alter American tactical doctrine for the remaining years of the Pacific War. The effectiveness of shape-charged munitions against relatively thin armor was demonstrated with undeniable conviction. However, equally significant was the proof that skillfully coordinated defensive fire could destroy entire attacking formations before they even reached effective range for return fire. The lesson learned from this night engagement was abundantly clear. The harmonious integration of various weapon systems creates a synergistic effect, whose results far exceed the simple sum of each component's individual capabilities. For men like Shira, this night battle became far more than just a successfully conducted defensive operation. The bazooka, which had until recently been regarded as an almost experimental weapon on training grounds, had now firmly established itself as reliable combat equipment. It was destined to become a standard item of gear for Marine infantry units that would face enemy armor. This 2.36-inch launcher empowered ordinary riflemen with the ability to destroy tanks that previously required cumbersome and specialized anti-tank guns to defeat. This event fundamentally altered the tactical balance of power between armor and infantry. Soon, in just a few weeks, Saipan Island would be declared completely secure, and its airfields would be rapidly converted into key bases for B-29 strategic bombers, which would begin the methodical and systematic destruction of Japan's industrial potential. The tank attack, intended as a devastating blow to drive the Marines back into the sea, paradoxically only accelerated Japan's inevitable defeat. It led to the destruction of invaluable mobile reserves that could have significantly prolonged the campaign. With the complete routing of the 9th Tank Regiment, Japanese commanders lost their primary tool for counterattacks against the constantly expanding American perimeter. However, the broader implications of this night battle extended far beyond Saipan. The tactical methods, brilliantly proven effective in night combat, were immediately refined and subsequently applied in all remaining operations in the Mariana Islands. There, Japanese forces would face American units that were not only equipped with the latest and most effective anti-tank weapons, but also expertly trained to coordinate their use. The technology of the shaped charge, still considered semi-fantastical in 1943, rapidly transformed into the accepted standard by which infantry anti-tank power was now measured. A soldier named Brown, meticulously cleaning his rifle, displayed the same thoroughness with which he loaded bazooka rockets. He, like many others, intuitively understood that both weapons were, in essence, different manifestations of the same fundamental truth. Properly directed American industrial might could produce equipment that empowered individual soldiers with capabilities that previously required much larger army units. An empty M1 bazooka weighed only 13 pounds, but its destructive potential allowed it to destroy tanks that represented months of enemy production efforts and years of crew training. The exhaustion that gripped the Marine positions after their ordeal gradually gave way to a deep, quiet satisfaction as the full implications of their victory became clear. They didn't just withstand a night attack. They managed to completely annihilate an entire enemy regiment while suffering almost negligible losses in comparison. The astonishing casualty ratios recorded after this battle were a direct reflection of technological and tactical advantages that only intensified as American industry reached full production capacity and troop training programs refined lessons learned directly on the battlefield. On Saipan, America's ability to adapt quickly in combat clashed irreconcilably with Japan's tactical inflexibility. The ultimate outcome clearly demonstrated that well-coordinated actions by small units could utterly defeat significantly larger formations if the latter remained committed to outdated and ineffective doctrine. Artificial light, which turned the pitch black of night into something resembling day, combined with destructive shape charges that effectively nullified the importance of armor thickness, created unprecedented conditions on the battlefield. In this new reality, the desperate courage of Japanese soldiers could no longer compensate for the colossal technological and tactical backwardness that, unfortunately for them, only worsened with each passing day of the ongoing war. This battle served as a vivid testament to how innovation and adaptation can turn the tide of any, even seemingly hopeless, struggle.